The Eterna Hotel stood as a monument to human opulence and ambition, perched atop a cliff that overlooked a restless sea. Its shimmering glass facade reflected the world outside, a world that seemed to dim in its presence. Guests arrived in awe, their necks craning to take in the cascading balconies and golden accents that adorned the building's exterior. The hotel's tagline, "Where Eternity Awaits," was etched above the revolving glass doors in an elegant script, a promise that felt more profound than the average marketing slogan. For Clara Hayes, a freelance travel writer, the Eterna Hotel was a long-awaited assignment. As her car ascended the winding driveway, she couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched, though there wasn't a soul outside. The sea breeze carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and unwelcoming, but the sight of the hotel quickly pushed her unease aside. 5 stars and then some, she muttered, reaching for her camera. Inside, the lobby was a masterpiece of excess. Polished marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the soft glow of an intricate chandelier that looked as though it had been plucked from the ceiling of a royal palace. The staff were everywhere, yet eerily silent, their movements synchronized to an almost inhuman degree. From the bellhops to the concierge, every gesture was deliberate, efficient, and unervingly perfect. Clara approached the reception desk, where a woman with an immaculate bun and a name tag that read Evelyn greeted her. "Welcome to the Eterna Hotel," Evelyn said, her voice syrupy and calm, though her eyes seemed to search Clara's face as if scanning for secrets. "Your room is ready. Please enjoy your stay." The check-in process was seamless, yet something about Evelyn's demeanor unsettled Clara. She brushed it off as fatigue from her journey and followed a bellhop to her room on the 5th floor. As they stepped into the elevator, Clara noticed a small, ornate plaque that listed the hotel's amenities: a world-class spa, an infinity pool, and a ballroom said to host exclusive midnight events. But what caught her attention most was a small, gilded warning beneath the list. Guests are advised to remain in their rooms after midnight. The room was as luxurious as she had imagined. Thick velvet curtains framed a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the ocean, now dark and endless. The bed was adorned with pillows so plush they seemed to invite sleep itself, and a bottle of champagne sat chilling on the table with a handwritten note, "To your unforgettable stay." Clara poured herself a glass and stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Yet the longer she stared, the more the scene unsettled her. The ocean seemed to move with an unnatural rhythm, and for a moment, she thought she saw something rise from the water before disappearing beneath the surface. That night, Clara's sleep was restless. Dreams of faceless figures and endless hallways plagued her, but each time she awoke, she could hear the faintest sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. They weren't hurried or aimless, but deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. By morning, the unease that had taken root in Clara's mind had not dissipated. At breakfast, she sat alone in the grand dining room, watching the other guests. Everyone looked normal, yet there was a peculiar stillness about them, as though they were waiting for something. The staff glided silently between tables, their smiles unwavering. As Clara sipped her coffee, her eyes wandered to a massive painting on the wall, a depiction of the hotel, but not as it currently stood. In the painting, the Eterna was surrounded by shadowy figures, their features blurred but their postures menacing. Beneath the painting, a plaque read, "Founded in 1898, where eternity awaits." It was only her first day, but Clara already felt as though the Eterna Hotel had begun wrapping its tendrils around her. Something wasn't right. Something lurked beneath the pristine surface, waiting for her to notice. She didn't yet know that her stay would be unforgettable, not as a promise, but as a warning. The morning sun filtered through the thick velvet curtains of Clara's room, yet the brightness brought little comfort. She lingered at the window, watching as the waves crashed rhythmically against the jagged rocks below. The unsettling dreams of the night before still clung to her mind, faint whispers at the edge of her thoughts. She had woken several times, convinced she had heard footsteps outside her door. Each time, however, the corridor was empty. Determined to shake off the lingering unease, Clara decided to explore the Eterna Hotel in daylight. If the grandeur of the lobby was any indication, there would be no shortage of beauty to photograph. She grabbed her camera and ventured out, the soft hum of the elevator welcoming her into its gilded confines. The corridors were impossibly pristine, their carpets devoid of even a single thread out of place. Clara noticed something peculiar as she passed staff members. They all moved with a mechanical grace, their footsteps perfectly measured and almost silent. The maids dusting the light fixtures didn't acknowledge her presence, nor did the bellhops pushing luggage carts down the hall. It wasn't rudeness. It was as though she didn't exist to them. Her first stop was the rooftop infinity pool, a marvel she'd read about in travel magazines. Stepping out onto the rooftop terrace, Clara was greeted by a breathtaking view of the ocean meeting the horizon. The pool appeared endless, its edges blurring seamlessly into the sky. Yet, for all its beauty, the scene was unnervingly empty. Not a single guest lounged in the chairs, and the water's surface was eerily still, as though it hadn't been touched in years. As Clara raised her camera, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. A figure stood at the far edge of the pool, gazing out at the sea. The man was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his posture rigid. Clara lowered her camera to call out to him, but when she glanced back, he was gone. Shaking off the strange encounter, Clara decided to head to the ballroom, which the concierge had mentioned during check-in. She wandered through the maze of corridors, guided by gilded signs pointing toward the grand ballroom. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though she were walking against an invisible current. When she finally reached the ballroom, she was met with an unexpected sight: a group of staff meticulously polishing the room's grand chandeliers. They moved in unison, their actions so synchronized it looked like a choreographed performance. Clara cleared her throat to get their attention, but no one turned. "Excuse me," she said louder this time. Her voice echoed in the vast space, but the staff continued their work as though they hadn't heard her. Feeling a chill creep up her spine, Clara stepped back, nearly tripping over a small object on the floor. It was a silver tray, the kind used for serving drinks, but it was empty save for a folded piece of paper. Curiosity got the better of her, and she picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, as though written in haste. "Do not trust the staff. They are not what they seem." Clara's breath hitched, and she instinctively looked around, but the ballroom was suddenly empty. The synchronized workers had vanished, leaving behind no trace that they had ever been there. The chandeliers hung motionless, their crystals refracting the sunlight streaming in through the arched windows. Heart racing, Clara clutched the note tightly and backed out of the ballroom. Her instincts screamed for her to leave the hotel altogether, but something deeper, something inexplicable, held her back. The Eterna Hotel was no ordinary luxury retreat, and whatever secrets it harbored, Clara was determined to uncover them. Little did she know, the cost of such knowledge would be far greater than she could ever imagine. Clara retreated to her room after her unsettling encounter in the ballroom, clutching the cryptic note as though it held the key to her survival. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it again, rereading the hastily scrawled words: "Do not trust the staff. They are not what they seem." Questions tumbled through her mind. Who had left the note? Why the warning? And most chilling of all, what did it mean that the staff were not what they seemed? Determined to ground herself, Clara decided to catalog her experience through writing and photographs. She laid her notebook and camera on the desk and began jotting down everything she had observed since her arrival. The synchronized movements of the staff, the eerie emptiness of the rooftop pool, the mysterious figure who had vanished into thin air. Yet, as she wrote, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The room's atmosphere seemed to shift subtly, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Clara paused, her pen hovering above the page. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement near the floor-length mirror. Turning quickly, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, only her own reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale. She exhaled shakily, convincing herself that her nerves were playing tricks. To distract herself, she reviewed the photos she had taken earlier. Most were unremarkable shots of the hotel's grand architecture, but one image made her blood run cold. In the photo of the ballroom, the group of synchronized staff members appeared slightly blurred, as though caught in mid-motion. Behind them, however, stood a dark figure that she hadn't noticed in person. The silhouette was faint but unmistakable, a shadowy presence watching from the far corner of the room. Clara's first instinct was to delete the image, but she hesitated. If something strange was happening at the Eterna Hotel, evidence might be her only protection. She saved the photo and quickly turned off her camera, feeling exposed as long as it was on. The afternoon stretched on, with Clara unable to shake the feeling of unease. She decided to explore further, this time heading toward the library, which the concierge had mentioned in passing. The library was tucked away on the third floor, its entrance marked by heavy oak doors. Pushing them open, Clara stepped into a cavernous room lined with towering bookshelves. The scent of aged paper and leather filled the air, lending the space an aura of quiet authority. Unlike other parts of the hotel, the library was not empty. A man in a charcoal gray suit sat in a leather armchair near the fireplace, flipping through a worn book. His presence was oddly reassuring, a rare instance of normalcy amidst the day's strange events. Clara approached cautiously, clearing her throat to announce herself. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you mind if I join you?" The man looked up, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He was older, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Clara sat down, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of her notebook. "Have you been staying here long?" she asked, eager for conversation that might ground her. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Longer than I'd care to admit," he replied cryptically. "This hotel has a way of keeping its guests entertained." There was something unsettling about his choice of words, but Clara pressed on. "Have you noticed anything unusual here?" The man closed his book and leaned forward, his expression grave. "You've felt it, haven't you? The weight of this place. The way it watches." Clara's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" He glanced around the library, as if ensuring they were alone. "This hotel isn't just bricks and mortar. It's alive, feeding off the people who stay here. And the staff? They're its hands and eyes." A chill ran down Clara's spine as the man's words sank in. Before she could ask more, a sharp knock echoed through the library. Both of them turned toward the door, but no one entered. When Clara looked back, the man was gone, his chair empty as though he had never been there. Alone once more, Clara felt the walls close in around her. She knew she had stumbled into something far more sinister than she could have imagined. The Eterna Hotel was no mere luxury retreat. It was a predator, and she was its latest prey. Clara returned to her room in a haze of confusion and fear, her mind reeling from the encounter in the library. The man's ominous words echoed in her thoughts. The hotel is alive. She tried to convince herself it was just a metaphor, the ramblings of a paranoid mind. But deep down, she couldn't deny the strangeness that surrounded her since her arrival. To steady her nerves, she decided to distract herself by researching the hotel's history. Clara retrieved her laptop and settled onto the bed, the soft glow of the screen casting long shadows on the walls. A quick search revealed that the Eterna Hotel had been built nearly a century ago, a passion project of a reclusive millionaire named Edward Vance. The hotel's opulence had been unparalleled for its time, attracting wealthy guests from around the world. But as Clara delved deeper, a darker story began to emerge. The Eterna had been plagued by tragedy almost from the start. Guests often disappeared without explanation, and strange accidents claimed the lives of staff members. Over the years, rumors swirled about hauntings and curses, though none were ever substantiated. The hotel's reputation grew so infamous that, for decades, it sat abandoned, its gilded halls gathering dust. The most chilling discovery was an old black-and-white photograph of the original staff. Clara froze when she spotted a familiar face among them. It was the man from the library, his piercing blue eyes unmistakable even in the grainy image. The caption below the photo identified him as Jonathan Lorne, Head concierge, 1925. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the photograph. It couldn't be him. Jonathan Lorne would be over 100 years old by now. Yet, there was no denying the uncanny resemblance. Clara saved the image, her trembling fingers betraying her rising panic. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall behind her. Clara's breath caught as she turned to face it. The noise grew louder, more insistent, as though something or someone was trying to break through. Mustering her courage, she approached the wall and pressed her ear against it. "Help us," a muffled voice whispered, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. She scanned the room, searching for an explanation, but the walls were solid, their pristine paint unmarred. Fighting the urge to flee, she instead grabbed her camera, determined to document whatever was happening. Her instincts led her back to the ballroom, the place where she had first felt the hotel's oppressive energy. The air grew colder as she neared, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty halls. Pushing open the grand double doors, Clara was greeted by a sight that made her blood run cold. The room was empty, save for the chandeliers swaying gently as if moved by an unseen force. But what truly terrified her was the writing that now adorned the far wall. In bold, uneven strokes, scrawled in what appeared to be ash, were the words, "Leave while you still can." Clara's breath hitched as she raised her camera to capture the message. As the flash illuminated the room, she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. Turning quickly, she saw them, the staff, standing perfectly still in the shadows, their faces obscured. They weren't watching her with their eyes, but Clara felt their gaze all the same, heavy and suffocating. Clara bolted from the ballroom, her instincts screaming at her to run. She didn't stop until she was safely locked inside her room, her chest heaving with exertion and terror. Leaning against the door, she realized there was no longer any question about what she had to do. She had to leave the Eterna Hotel. But as she reached for her phone to call a taxi, the screen flickered to life on its own. A message appeared in the center of the display, written in the same jagged script as the note she had found earlier. "You cannot escape." Tears pricked Clara's eyes as dread consumed her. She was no longer a guest at the Eterna Hotel. She was its prisoner. Clara's resolve to leave the Eterna Hotel had never been stronger, yet the foreboding message on her phone shook her to the core. She paced her room, clutching the device, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. The hotel was no longer a mystery to solve. It was a trap. Her only goal now was survival. Deciding that waiting would only deepen her peril, Clara quickly packed her belongings. She threw clothes into her suitcase with trembling hands and slipped her camera into her bag, determined to hold on to her evidence. Her fingers lingered on the cryptic note she'd found, its warning still echoing in her mind. "Do not trust the staff." When she opened her door, the hallway was eerily silent, its endless stretch illuminated by cold, fluorescent light. Clara hesitated, listening for any sign of movement, but the air carried nothing but a heavy stillness. She crept toward the elevator, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Her heart leaped when the familiar ding signaled its arrival. The elevator doors slid open, revealing an empty car. Clara stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. She watched the numbers descend, each floor bringing her closer to freedom. But as the elevator reached the second floor, it jolted to a stop. The lights flickered, and the air grew stiflingly hot. "Come on," Clara muttered, jamming her finger against the lobby button. The elevator didn't move. Instead, the lights extinguished completely, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged, and she reached for her phone to use the flashlight, but as she unlocked the screen, another message appeared. "Meet your host." A faint red light flickered on, illuminating the elevator's interior. To Clara's horror, the mirrors lining the walls no longer reflected her image. Instead, they revealed a warped version of the elevator, a twisted, decrepit space filled with shadows that writhed and shifted. In the corner of one mirror, she spotted a figure, a man in a tailored suit, his face hidden in shadow. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer, but a voice filled the space, low and resonant, as though the walls themselves were speaking. "You've seen too much, Clara, but perhaps you can still be of use." The elevator shuddered and began to descend, faster than before, the red light pulsating like a heartbeat. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her fear mounting as the voice continued. "The Eterna is more than a hotel. It is a gateway, and I am its steward. Those who stay here become part of it, their stories woven into its very fabric. You, Clara, have the chance to join something eternal. I don't want any part of this," Clara shouted, her voice echoing unnaturally. The elevator stopped abruptly, the doors sliding open to reveal a grand, cavernous room she had never seen before. It was a banquet hall unlike any other, its opulence overwhelming yet grotesque. The tables were adorned with golden candelabras, their flames casting an eerie glow over dishes that looked suspiciously untouched. Around the room stood dozens of people dressed in vintage clothing, their faces blank and lifeless. In the center of the room stood the figure from the mirrors. Now fully illuminated, he was tall and imposing, his suit immaculate, his face sharp and unervingly perfect. But his eyes were empty voids, black as the deepest night. "Welcome to the heart of the Eterna," he said, spreading his arms wide. "Your place at the table awaits." Clara stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't belong here. Let me go." The man's smile was cold and humorless. "No one leaves, Clara, but you already know that. The question is not whether you will stay. It is how you will serve." Before Clara could respond, the people in the room turned toward her in unison, their movements mechanical and unnatural. She realized with dawning horror that their expressions were eerily familiar. They were the staff, the same synchronized group she had seen in the ballroom. Clara bolted back into the elevator, slamming her hand against the buttons. The man's laughter followed her as the doors slid shut. The elevator began to rise, but the red light remained, pulsating like a living thing. The voice returned, softer this time, almost a whisper. "You cannot escape, Clara. The Eterna already has you." As the elevator neared her floor, Clara's mind raced with questions and plans. Who was the steward? Was there truly no way out? One thing was certain. She was no longer just a guest. She was part of the Eterna story now, whether she wanted to be or not. When the elevator doors opened onto her floor, Clara hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar corridor stretched before her, but it no longer felt safe. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. She stepped out cautiously, her suitcase dragging behind her like a ball and chain. She needed a plan. The events in the banquet hall had shattered any illusion that she could simply walk out of the Eterna Hotel. The staff were not ordinary people. They were something else entirely, tied to the hotel in ways she didn't yet understand. And the steward, with his piercing black eyes and cryptic words, had made it clear that escape was not an option. Clara made her way back to her room, locking the door behind her and wedging a chair beneath the handle for good measure. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Her gaze fell on the black and white photo she had saved earlier. The man in the library, Jonathan Lorne. He had been part of the hotel since its inception. Could he hold the key to its secrets? Desperate for answers, Clara decided to investigate further. She retrieved the hotel's directory from the nightstand, flipping through its pages for any mention of Lorne or the banquet hall. Her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. Pulling it out, she unfolded it to reveal a handwritten note. "Trust no one but the mirrors." Clara frowned, the cryptic message offering more questions than answers. The mirrors. The phrase stirred something in her memory. Her reflection missing in the elevator, the steward appearing in the glass. What was it about the mirrors? She needed to test this theory. She grabbed a small pocket mirror from her bag and stood in front of the ornate full-length mirror near the bathroom. Holding the pocket mirror up, she angled it so it reflected the large one. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just an endless loop of reflections. But as she stared, the image began to shift. In the mirror's reflection, her hotel room was no longer empty. Figures moved silently in the background, shadowy and indistinct. Clara's breath hitched as she realized they were staff members, their synchronized movements unmistakable. But when she turned to look at the actual room, it was empty. The air grew colder as Clara returned her gaze to the mirror. The figures were no longer in the background. They were moving closer, their faces still obscured. A wave of panic surged through her as the realization struck. The mirrors didn't just reflect, they revealed. Clara grabbed her camera, snapping a photo of the mirror just as one of the figures reached its hand toward her reflection. The flash briefly lit the room, and she stumbled backward, the mirror now showing only her wide-eyed reflection. She reviewed the photo on her camera screen. The figures were still there, but now their faces were visible. They were identical to the staff she had encountered in the banquet hall, lifeless yet disturbingly human. Her chest tightened as a new thought crept into her mind. What if the mirrors were not just windows but doors? What if the figures could cross over? The very idea made her skin crawl. She needed to destroy the mirror, but something told her it wasn't that simple. The steward had referred to the hotel as a gateway. What if breaking the mirror unleashed something far worse? A sudden knock at the door made her jump. It was sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence like a knife. Clara froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who is it?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's room service, ma'am," came the reply, unnervingly monotone. Clara didn't move, her instincts screaming at her not to answer. The knocking grew louder, more forceful. She glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figures again, but it reflected only her pale, terrified face. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, the steward's voice drifted through, calm and chilling. "You can't hide from us, Clara. You're already ours." Her pulse raced as she realized she had no choice but to face whatever was on the other side of the door. She grabbed the camera and the pocket mirror, her only weapons against the unseen forces that held her captive. As she approached the door, she resolved to uncover the truth about the Eterna Hotel, even if it meant confronting the horrors waiting for her on the other side. Taking a deep breath, Clara removed the chair and slowly unlocked the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, but a new note lay on the floor, written in the same jagged script she had seen before. "The mirrors hold the way, but the cost is high." Clara picked up the note, her hands trembling. She didn't know who had left it or what the price would be, but she understood one thing with chilling clarity. The mirrors were her only way out, and the Eterna Hotel wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Clara sat in the center of her room, her back pressed against the bed, clutching the note like a lifeline. The phrase, "the mirrors hold the way, but the cost is high," echoed in her mind, unraveling her thoughts into a tangle of fear and determination. The Eterna Hotel wasn't just a place. It was a labyrinth of secrets, each corridor and room a fragment of a puzzle she was desperate to solve. She set the note down and examined the photograph of the figures in the mirror. Their frozen, lifeless expressions felt uncomfortably intimate, as though they were staring directly at her through the glossy surface. The steward's voice lingered in her ears. "You're already ours." But was she? And if the mirrors held the way out, what exactly was the cost? Her gaze returned to the full-length mirror. It stood like a sentinel, its polished surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Clara had avoided touching it since her earlier discovery, but now she approached cautiously, her fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the glass. What if the note was a trap, designed to lure her deeper into the hotel's grasp? Taking a deep breath, she pressed her palm against the mirror surface. It was cold, unnaturally so, like the air inside a freezer. For a moment, nothing happened, but as she kept her hand there, a faint ripple spread outward, distorting her reflection. The room behind her seemed to blur and shift, replaced by something darker, a vast, shadowy corridor lit by a dim, unnatural glow. Clara yanked her hand back, her heart pounding. The reflection returned to normal, but she had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. The mirrors were more than just reflections. They were portals, gateways to something hidden within the Eterna Hotel. Determined to gather more information, Clara retrieved the pocket mirror from her bag. She stood in front of the full-length mirror again, angling the smaller one to reflect the larger. The result sent a chill down her spine. Instead of the infinite reflection she expected, the pocket mirror revealed something entirely different, a glimpse into another room. The room in the reflection was lavish, even more extravagant than her suite, but its elegance was marred by signs of decay. The wallpaper peeled in jagged strips, and the chandelier hung at an awkward angle, its crystals blackened and dull. In the center of the room stood a figure, Jonathan Lorne. He appeared to be studying a book, his expression tense. "Jonathan," Clara whispered, as if he might hear her through the layers of glass. The figure didn't move, but as she watched, the image began to distort. Jonathan's reflection turned sharply toward her, his eyes wide with alarm. He mouthed something, his lips forming words she couldn't hear. Clara leaned closer, trying to decipher his message. Just as she thought she understood, a single word, "Run." The reflection shattered. The pocket mirror slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor, the shards scattering like fallen stars. The room grew colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward her. Panic surged as Clara realized she wasn't alone. Turning quickly, she saw them, the figures from the mirrors. They were faint, like smoke given form, but their presence was undeniable. They drifted closer, their movements slow but deliberate. Grabbing her camera, Clara snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the room for a brief moment. The figures recoiled, their shapes flickering like dying flames. She seized the opportunity, backing toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the hotel itself had locked her in, forcing her to confront whatever lay within the mirror's depths. As the figures advanced again, Clara's mind raced. The pocket mirror might be broken, but the full-length mirror remained intact. It was her only chance. Steeling herself, she turned to face it, the surface rippling as if inviting her in. With no other options, Clara stepped forward, her hand pressing against the glass until it gave way. She felt a jolt, as though she had been pulled through a sheet of ice, and then the room vanished. Clara found herself standing in the dim, shadowy corridor she had glimpsed earlier. The air was heavy with a metallic tang, and the faint glow of distant lights cast eerie patterns on the walls. The mirrors had brought her here, but the question remained. Where exactly was here, and what price would she pay to find her way back? Clara steadied herself in the unfamiliar corridor, her breath visible in the frigid air. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, constructed from blackened stone that absorbed the faint light rather than reflecting it. Small sconces held dimly flickering flames, their shadows casting dancing patterns that seemed alive. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, like blood mixed with rust. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint echo of her own footsteps. Clara glanced behind her, expecting to see the shimmering surface of the mirror she had just passed through, but it was gone. In its place stood a solid wall, smooth and unyielding. She was trapped, truly, this time, with no apparent way back. The corridor felt alive, as if it were watching her. Every few steps, Clara thought she heard whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, growing louder as she pressed forward. She strained to make out words, but they remained just beyond comprehension, teasing her with their familiarity. Eventually, the corridor split into two paths. Both were identical, disappearing into darkness. Clara hesitated, her instincts urging her to choose carefully. The left path exuded a faint warmth, its shadows less oppressive, while the right seemed colder, the flames in its sconces barely alive. The memory of Jonathan's reflection, his mouthed warning to run, replayed in her mind. Choosing the left path, Clara moved cautiously, her camera slung over her shoulder like a talisman. The warmth grew stronger, but it wasn't comforting. It was stifling, suffocating. The walls seemed to shimmer with an unnatural heat, distorting her vision. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she ventured deeper, her resolve tested by the oppressive atmosphere. The whispers grew louder here, forming a rhythmic cadence that matched her heartbeat. At first, it was unnerving, but then Clara realized it wasn't random. The whispers were speaking her name. Clara, Clara. The sound was neither inviting nor hostile, but its familiarity unnerved her. She quickened her pace, desperate to escape the disembodied voices. She came upon a door, its surface carved with intricate patterns of flames and faces. The faces appeared to writhe and twist, their expressions shifting between agony and ecstasy. Clara hesitated, but the whispers behind her urged her forward, growing insistent, almost frantic. Placing a trembling hand on the doorknob, she turned it and stepped inside. The room was vast, impossibly large given the narrow corridor outside. A circular chamber stretched upward into darkness, its walls covered in mirrors of varying sizes. Each mirror reflected something different. Not the room itself, but scenes from lives unknown to Clara. One showed a young woman sobbing in a darkened bedroom, her face buried in her hands. Another displayed a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the void. At the center of the room stood an ornate pedestal, upon which rested a large, cracked mirror. Its surface pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, drawing Clara toward it. As she approached, she saw her own reflection, distorted, fractured, and surrounded by shadowy figures. "Welcome," a voice said, startling her. Clara turned to find a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured. It was the steward, but his appearance was different now. His suit was torn and frayed, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes glowing faintly like embers. "You've come far, Clara, but you're not supposed to be here yet." "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Where am I? What is this place?" The steward stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You are in the Corridor of Echoes, a place between, a reflection of the Eterna Hotel, where those who stray too far must pay their dues." He gestured to the mirrors. "Every choice you've made, every fear you've harbored, lives here, and it feeds the hotel." Clara's stomach churned as she realized the scenes in the mirrors were tied to the guests who had disappeared. Their fears, their pain, had been captured and amplified, bound to this place. She turned back to the cracked mirror on the pedestal, its surface now swirling with darkness. "What do you want from me?" Clara asked, her voice a mix of defiance and dread. The steward's lips curved into a chilling smile. "Not me, Clara. The hotel. It chose you. And now, you must decide. Step through the mirror and accept the truth, or stay and become another echo." Clara's heart pounded as the room seemed to close in around her. The cracked mirror loomed before her, its pulsing light growing stronger. Whatever choice she made, there would be no turning back. Clara stood paralyzed in the eerie chamber, the cracked mirror's pulsating glow bathing her face in an unsettling light. The steward's words reverberated in her mind. "Step through the mirror and accept the truth, or stay and become another echo." Her instinct screamed to turn and run, but the oppressive walls of the chamber offered no escape. The mirrors around her reflected distorted versions of herself, some frightened, others enraged, and one that smirked with unsettling confidence. Summoning her courage, Clara approached the pedestal. The closer she got, the louder the mirror pulsed, the vibrations resonating in her chest. She peered into its fractured surface, her reflection now fragmented into dozens of broken shards. But within those shards, she glimpsed something else, a room she recognized. It was her childhood bedroom, unchanged from the day she left for college. The pale yellow walls, the fairy lights strung along the bed frame, and her collection of books on the worn shelf all stood frozen in time. She reached out instinctively, her fingertips grazing the cold, glassy surface. A sharp jolt surged through her hand, making her gasp. The steward stepped closer, his presence oppressive. "The truth is not always kind, Clara. What lies beyond will test you, but it's the only way forward." With a deep breath, Clara pressed her palm firmly against the mirror. The glass gave way like water, rippling around her hand and pulling her forward. Her vision blurred as the world around her dissolved, and she felt the disorienting sensation of falling. Not downward, but inward, as though being pulled into the core of her own mind. When the dizziness subsided, Clara found herself standing in her childhood bedroom. It was exactly as she remembered, down to the faint smell of lavender from the sachet tucked beneath her pillow. The air was warm and still, a stark contrast to the cold corridors she had just left. But something felt off. The edges of the room seemed to shimmer, as if the entire space were an illusion barely holding together. Clara walked to the desk where her old diary lay open, the pen beside it frozen mid-stroke. She picked it up and read the entry, her own handwriting staring back at her. "They're watching me again. I don't know who they are, but I feel them every night, just beyond the edge of the light. I think they want me to do something, but I don't know what. I'm scared." The words jolted her memory. She had written this at 16, during a period when she suffered from vivid nightmares. She had chalked them up to stress and an overactive imagination, but standing here now, those fears felt unnervingly real. "Do you remember now?" The steward's voice echoed, though he was nowhere to be seen. "The hotel didn't choose you at random, Clara. You've always belonged to it." Her pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" she shouted, spinning around. The shimmering edges of the room grew more pronounced, and the walls began to shift, elongating and twisting like molten glass. The furniture melted into the floor, leaving Clara standing in an amorphous void. The steward materialized before her, his gaunt figure more menacing than before. "Your nightmares weren't just dreams. They were invitations. The hotel has been calling you for years, grooming you, preparing you. This is your destiny." "No!" Clara shouted, backing away. But as she stepped away from him, her foot sank into the shifting ground. She looked down to see her leg being swallowed by the void, dark tendrils wrapping around her ankle. "You can't fight it," the steward said, his tone almost pitying. "But you can choose how you face it. The truth or the void. Those are your only options." Clara's mind raced. The steward's words felt like a trap, a way to manipulate her into submission. She clenched her fists, fighting the pull of the void. As her gaze darted around the shifting expanse, she spotted something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light, like the surface of a mirror. Summoning every ounce of strength, Clara wrenched her leg free and ran toward the light. The steward's laughter echoed behind her, but she didn't look back. The light grew brighter, and as she reached it, she threw herself forward, desperate for escape. She collided with something solid, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Gasping, Clara opened her eyes to find herself back in the corridor. The cracked mirror was gone, replaced by a blank wall. The steward was nowhere in sight, but the oppressive atmosphere of the hotel remained. Clara leaned against the wall, her breath ragged. She had escaped the void, but the steward's words lingered. "You've always belonged to it." The hotel wasn't just a place. It was a part of her story, one she had yet to fully understand. And if she wanted to survive, she would have to uncover the truth before it consumed her entirely. Clara stood in the shadowy corridor, her thoughts spinning like the fragments of a broken mirror. What had she just witnessed? The sensation of falling inward, of being drawn into the very fabric of her memories, still haunted her. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to make sense of it all. The steward's words echoed in her mind. "You've always belonged to it." She had narrowly escaped the void. But what did it all mean? The hallway stretched before her, endless and dark, but for the faint glow of distant sconces that cast their flickering light on the walls. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her just beyond the next turn, something she was meant to confront. The oppressive silence of the hotel pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. There was no escape, no way to turn back now. Despite her fear, she knew she had no choice but to continue forward. The deeper she ventured, the more the walls seemed to close in, narrowing until she found herself in front of yet another door. This one ancient, its wood darkened with age and neglect. There was no inscription, no indication of what lay beyond. But Clara felt drawn to it, as if it held the key to everything. With a trembling hand, she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in a layer of grime. The faint smell of decay lingered in the stagnant air. At first, there seemed to be nothing of significance within, just another forgotten space in the sprawling labyrinth of the hotel. But then Clara noticed the mirrors. Dozens of them, mounted on the walls at odd angles, some cracked, others perfectly intact. They were large, old-fashioned mirrors, with gilded frames that had long since lost their shine. As she moved deeper into the room, she saw that each one reflected a different version of herself. In one, she was younger, a wide-eyed child standing in front of her childhood home. In another, she was older, a woman with lines of worry etched into her face, standing in a darkened room filled with shadows. A chill ran down Clara's spine. The mirrors didn't just show her appearance. They reflected her life, her choices, and her regrets. Each one seemed to capture a different moment in time, frozen in place, as if the reflections themselves were memories, snapshots of her existence. In one mirror, Clara saw herself running through the woods, breathless and terrified. She recognized the scene instantly. It was from the night she had disappeared for 3 days as a teenager. She had been found in the woods, disoriented and exhausted, unable to remember where she had been or what had happened. Her parents had chalked it up to a runaway attempt, but Clara had never understood what had truly occurred during those missing days. The mirror reflected that time, those lost hours, perfectly. Another mirror captured a more recent memory, the day she had walked into the hotel for the first time. She had been intrigued by its grandeur, excited by the mystery it promised. But now, looking at her reflection in that mirror, Clara saw something different. A flicker of doubt in her eyes, a subtle hint of fear that she hadn't noticed before. The steward's voice broke through her thoughts. Each mirror holds a choice, Clara. A moment when your path could have gone in a different direction. But you chose to come here, and now you must choose again. Clara spun around, her heart racing. The steward was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What is this place?" "The hotel is not just a building," the steward explained, his voice calm and cold. "It is a reflection of your own choices, your desires, and your fears. Everything you've done has led you here, and now you must decide who you will become. The mirrors show you the paths you didn't take, the roads left unexplored. But you cannot stay here forever. Choose." Clara's mind whirled. How could she choose? Each mirror showed a version of herself, some happy, some haunted, some broken. She couldn't fathom what the right choice was, or if there even was one. How could she choose between versions of herself that she didn't even understand? The steward stepped forward, his expression softening. "There is no wrong choice, Clara. But once you make it, you must accept the consequences. This is the final test. The hotel's hold on you will break only when you choose who you are meant to be." Clara swallowed hard. The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest like a physical force. She turned back to the mirrors, her reflection now flickering in each one. Each version of herself seemed to be waiting, watching, urging her to make a choice. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped forward. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since she had entered the hotel, she felt a sense of clarity. The mirrors didn't just reflect her, they were her. They were the culmination of everything she had experienced, every decision she had made. She would choose not to be defined by the past, but to take control of her future. As she made her choice, the mirrors shattered with a deafening crack. The pieces fell to the ground like glass rain, and the room began to shake. The steward's face twisted into a look of surprise, but Clara didn't stop. She stepped through the wreckage of her past, ready to face whatever came next. Clara stood amidst the shards of broken glass, her heart pounding in her chest. The mirrors that had once reflected her fragmented self now lay in ruins at her feet. Their destruction felt like the breaking of a long-held illusion, but it also left a hollow space within her. What had she just chosen? And what did it mean for her future? She tried to steady her breath, but the weight of the moment was unbearable. The room began to change. The walls, once dark and decaying, now flickered with light, revealing a new dimension to the hotel. The shadows receded, replaced by a soft, almost ethereal glow. The air felt lighter, but the stillness remained, heavy with the unspoken consequences of her decision. Clara glanced around, looking for some sign that she had done the right thing, but there was nothing, just the silence and the debris of the mirrors strewn across the floor. The steward's voice echoed through the now transformed room. "You have chosen, Clara, but every choice comes with consequences. You cannot walk away unscathed. What you have decided is irreversible. The hotel will show you what lies ahead, but remember this: your path is yours to walk, and the weight of your decision will follow you." Clara's stomach twisted. What had she truly chosen? She had broken the mirrors, symbolically severing herself from the fragmented versions of her past. But had she truly escaped? Or had she just opened the door to a new kind of torment? The steward's words hinted at a price she hadn't considered. Before she could process any further, the walls of the room shifted once again. The once soft glow darkened, and Clara found herself standing in a long corridor. The hallway stretched far into the distance, its endlessness now taking on a claustrophobic quality. The floor beneath her feet creaked with every step, as though the very foundation of the hotel was unstable, groaning under the weight of what had transpired. Her mind raced with questions. Was this the result of her choice? Or had the hotel merely been waiting for her to reach this point? Each step forward felt like an acknowledgement of her decision, a commitment to the consequences, whatever they might be. She reached for the nearest door, its surface smooth and untouched by time, and pushed it open. Inside was a room she hadn't expected. The decor was lavish, opulent in a way that felt both foreign and eerily familiar. The walls were lined with velvet drapes, the furniture plush and luxurious. Yet, despite the grandeur of the space, a sense of unease settled over Clara. There was something too perfect about it, too arranged. It felt like a facade, a mask covering something darker. In the center of the room stood a mirror, one unbroken, its surface gleaming with a polished, almost seductive quality. Clara approached it slowly, wary of what it might reveal. The steward's words played in her mind. "The weight of your decision will follow you." Was this another reflection, another part of her life that she hadn't seen before? As Clara stood before the mirror, she felt the pull of it, the compulsion to look deeper, to see beyond the surface. She hesitated, her breath shallow. The reflection staring back at her was not the Clara she knew. Instead, she saw a version of herself that was poised, confident, and calm. Her expression was serene, as though she had found peace, yet there was a coldness in her eyes, a hollow certainty that unsettled Clara. She recoiled from the mirror, the image lingering in her mind like a nightmare. Was this what the hotel wanted her to become? A perfect version of herself, devoid of emotion and humanity? The mirror had promised clarity, but instead, it revealed a version of Clara she didn't recognize. Someone who had given in to the weight of consequence without resistance. Clara took a step back, her heart racing. She had chosen to confront her past, to break free from the mirrored versions of herself. But now she was faced with a new challenge. This perfect, cold version of herself was not the person she wanted to become. It was a warning, a reminder of what could happen if she allowed the hotel to reshape her identity. But she refused to accept it. Clara turned away from the mirror, her resolve hardening. She would not allow herself to be consumed by the consequences of her choice. The hotel might show her what it wanted, but she would choose her own path. She would find a way to retain her humanity, to stay true to herself, no matter how difficult the journey ahead. As she exited the room, the door behind her closed with a soft click, sealing away the reflection that had tried to claim her. The hallway stretched on, leading deeper into the heart of the hotel. Clara's steps were steady now, each one more confident than the last. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she had to face it. The weight of her decision would follow her, but she would carry it as a part of her, not as a burden. The hotel would not define her. She would define herself. Clara had moved deeper into the heart of the hotel, the endless corridors stretching before her, like an unwritten future. Despite the sense of urgency gnawing at her, a strange calm had begun to settle over her. She had confronted the mirror, rejected the false version of herself it had offered, and emerged unbroken. But now, as the hotel continued to change around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not in control. No matter how resolute her choices had been, it seemed that the hotel was always one step ahead, anticipating her every move. The corridor widened, and the walls seemed to breathe. It wasn't an illusion. The walls were alive, or at least, that's how it felt. The faint hum of energy vibrated through the air. Each step Clara took reverberated off the walls, but there was no sound, no echo, only a silence that was all-encompassing. It was as though she was walking through a dream, or perhaps through something more sinister, a place where time itself had lost its meaning. At the end of the hallway stood another door, this one made of dark mahogany, its surface intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The door looked ancient, and yet there was something oddly pristine about it, like it had been polished just moments before. Clara hesitated before reaching for the handle. Was this yet another test? Was there more to uncover about the hotel's twisted game? She had no answers, only questions that grew with every turn, with every step she took. She pushed the door open, and the room revealed itself, a vast, open space, almost too large for its surroundings. It was entirely white, the walls, ceiling, and floor all a blinding, almost surreal shade of alabaster. The emptiness was suffocating, yet Clara felt no urge to escape it. It was as though the room itself had been suspended outside of time, beyond the logic of reality. There were no windows, no doors, only the vast white expanse. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it sat a single object, a key. The key was made of gold, gleaming softly in the stark light. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Was this the key to her freedom? Could this be the way out of the hotel? The way to escape whatever twisted hold it had on her? She walked toward the pedestal, each step taking her deeper into the strange stillness of the room. When Clara reached the key, she felt a sense of déjà vu wash over her, as if she had been here before, in another life, in another time. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, but just as she touched it, a voice echoed from the farthest reaches of her mind. It wasn't the steward's voice, nor any familiar sound. It was a whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable in its tone. "The key is not your salvation, Clara." The words froze her in place. She withdrew her hand, the key's golden surface still shining brightly under the sterile light. What did it mean? If the key wasn't the way out, then what was? Clara's heart began to race as the voice continued in her mind, now louder, more urgent. "You've been here before, Clara. You've made this choice before. Do you remember?" The room seemed to shift around her. The once immaculate walls began to distort, folding inward as if the space itself was folding into a singularity. Clara felt an intense pressure build in her chest, and for a moment, she feared she might collapse under the weight of it. The key on the pedestal blurred and flickered, its form twisting as if it was caught between two realities, two timelines. Clara had been here before. The realization hit her with the force of a blow. Her breath, caught as fragments of memory, began to return to her, jagged and broken. The hotel, the key, the choice, it was all part of a cycle. She had made this choice before. She had faced this room, this pedestal, and perhaps even this key. But the outcome had always been the same. The key was never the solution. The hotel had trapped her in a loop, a never-ending cycle, where every decision she made ultimately led her back to the same point. She had never left. She had always been here. Suddenly, the voice ceased. The room returned to its pristine state, the walls now unyielding in their sterile perfection. Clara stood frozen, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. She hadn't just been walking through the hotel. She had been walking through her own subconscious, through her own fears and regrets. The hotel was not merely a physical place. It was a manifestation of her mind, a prison of her own making. Clara's body shook as she took a step back from the pedestal. She could feel the weight of her past pressing in on her, but she also felt a flicker of determination deep within her chest. She would not be trapped. She had to break free of the cycle. She had to accept that the key wasn't the answer. The key was the trap. With newfound resolve, Clara turned away from the pedestal and began to walk back toward the door. The room no longer felt infinite. The walls no longer closed in on her. She had broken free from the illusion. The key might have been the symbol of escape, but it was not the solution. The solution lay within herself, within her ability to confront the reality that she could not escape the past, only learn to live with it, only move forward. The door swung open before her, revealing the same hallway she had walked earlier. But now it felt different. The weight of the hotel's grasp on her seemed to have lightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt as if she had made a choice that was truly her own. The cycle had been broken. She had chosen freedom. Clara's mind raced as she stepped back into the familiar corridor. For a brief moment, she allowed herself the illusion of peace, of liberation. The weight that had once crushed her chest seemed to lift, and the hallway stretched out before her like an open path. But deep down, a gnawing doubt lingered. The hotel had always been full of tricks, and now, as she walked further into the darkened space, she couldn't help but wonder if she had truly escaped or if she had simply been given a temporary reprieve. With each step, Clara's thoughts became heavier. The once certain feeling of breaking free now seemed fragile, and she couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching her. The walls, once seemingly alive, now appeared cold and indifferent. The hotel had been a labyrinth, a maze that shifted and changed at will. Yet here she was, walking a seemingly endless path, uncertain whether she was moving forward or merely going in circles. As Clara reached the end of the corridor, another door appeared before her, its surface plain but uninviting. The absence of ornate carvings or intricate details was almost unsettling in its simplicity. The door seemed like a portal, a gateway to something else, but what lay beyond it? She had learned not to trust appearances within the hotel, but there was something compelling about the door that drew her toward it, as though the answer to her question lay just beyond its threshold. With a hesitant breath, Clara reached for the handle. Her fingers, still trembling from the recent revelation of the key's true nature, wrapped around the cool metal. The door creaked as it opened, its movements slow, deliberate. As she stepped through, she immediately felt a shift, a coldness that seeped into her bones, unlike the sterile white room she had just left. The room before her was dark, its shadows stretching like long fingers across the floor, threatening to engulf her. The air was thick with a heavy, almost suffocating stillness, broken only by the soft sound of a ticking clock somewhere in the distance. Clara's eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light that flickered faintly from an overhead lamp. She could barely make out the shapes in the room, a few pieces of furniture, but they were strangely positioned, as though someone had hastily rearranged them. Everything seemed out of place, as though the room itself was trying to create the illusion of normality, yet it felt deeply wrong. It was then that Clara noticed the mirror, another one, this time large and framed with elaborate dark wood. It stood against the far wall, reflecting nothing but empty space, as if the room were not even there. Her reflection was distorted in the glass, fragmented and incomplete. For a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her, a shadow flitting across the periphery of the mirror's surface. Clara spun around, but the room was empty. The sound of the ticking clock grew louder, more insistent, as though it was counting down to something inevitable. Compelled by an unsettling curiosity, Clara approached the mirror. Her reflection seemed to warp with every step she took, her features twisting into unfamiliar shapes. She reached out, fingers hovering just above the surface of the glass. The reflection of her hand wavered, and for an instant, it seemed as though her fingers were sinking into the mirror itself, as though the glass was no longer a solid barrier, but a gateway into another world. Clara pulled her hand back quickly, heart pounding. She stared at the mirror, and something shifted behind her. This time, she could hear it, footsteps, faint but unmistakable. She spun around, expecting to see the hallway, expecting to find a person or some other explanation for the sound. But there was nothing. The room remained empty, save for the heavy silence that threatened to suffocate her. The footsteps continued, however, growing closer, their rhythm synchronized with the ticking of the clock. The realization hit Clara like a shock to the spine. She was not alone. The hotel had been manipulating her every move, leading her into this trap. The price of freedom was not liberation. It was the endless pursuit of it, an eternal chase through a maze of her own making. Clara had broken free from the illusion, only to realize that the true cost of freedom was not escaping the hotel, but facing its depths, its shadows, and confronting the things that had haunted her for so long. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. Clara's heart raced as she looked desperately for a way out. But the door through which she had entered had vanished, replaced by yet another stretch of hallway. The ticking of the clock had become deafening, as if time itself was collapsing around her. The reflections in the mirror no longer just distorted her image. They became something else. They became the people she had lost, the people she had failed, their eyes staring back at her, accusing her. Clara realized then that the hotel had not merely been a physical space. It had been a reflection of her own mind, a manifestation of her guilt, her fear, and her inability to let go. It was a prison of her own creation. She had tried to escape, to break free, but in doing so, she had only trapped herself further. The clock ticked on, its relentless rhythm matching the beating of her own heart. She was no longer just a guest in the hotel. She was part of it, forever bound to its walls, to its mirrors, to its endless corridors. The footsteps stopped. The ticking of the clock ceased. The silence was deafening, but in that silence, Clara understood one truth. There was no escape. Not anymore. The hotel had claimed her, and she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions, her past, and the cost of her freedom. Clara stood in the now silent room, feeling the weight of its heavy, suffocating air. The once chaotic ticking of the clock had stopped, but the oppressive stillness remained, wrapping itself around her like a tight cloak. It wasn't just the eerie quiet that unsettled her. It was the sensation that the hotel itself had become aware of her presence, that it was watching her, measuring her every move. Each step she took seemed to echo unervingly in the vast emptiness, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the sound, forcing her into an uncomfortable silence. She glanced back at the mirror, half expecting it to reveal something new, something sinister hidden in the reflection. But as she approached it, she found that it was as empty and distorted as before. Her image flickered, and once again, Clara felt as though she was being swallowed up by the glass. The mirror no longer offered any clarity or comfort. It had become a distorted version of reality, a reflection of the chaos she had allowed into her life. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara allowed herself to think back on her life before the hotel, to the moments she had left behind. She had once been a different person, free, perhaps too carefree. But the hotel had a way of bringing out the darkest parts of herself, of forcing her to confront her own flaws, her own weaknesses. And the deeper she went, the more she realized that the hotel had not merely been a place. It had been a reflection of her mind, a manifestation of everything she had ever tried to hide. Her thoughts drifted to the day she had first arrived at the hotel. It had seemed like a simple choice, a routine stop during a long journey. She had checked in, gone to her room, and fallen into the rhythm of the place, unaware of the subtle shifts that had begun to occur around her. The strange occurrences, the oddities, had felt like harmless quirks at first. Doors that wouldn't open, strange noises at night, flickering lights. But gradually, they had escalated, each small disturbance building upon the last until Clara had been forced to confront the truth. The hotel was not just haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by her. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The hotel had been playing on her deepest fears and regrets, dragging her through an emotional landscape that was as twisted and distorted as the very wall she had walked through. The whispers she had heard, the eerie voices that had called her name, they were all echoes of her past, fragments of memories that she had tried to bury. Each room, each hallway had been a different chapter in her life, a place where she had been forced to confront the things she had tried to forget. It was a terrible irony. She had thought she could escape by leaving the hotel, but in doing so, she had never really left the place. The hotel was her mind, her memories, her regrets. It was a mirror, not just of the physical world, but of everything she had ever been, everything she had ever feared. It wasn't enough to simply escape the hotel. It was clear now that the only way out was to confront the past that she had been running from for so long. As Clara's thoughts grew darker, she heard the faint sound of footsteps again. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but it was unmistakable. She wasn't alone. She turned sharply, but the room was still empty. The footsteps continued, now louder, more deliberate. They came closer, but Clara couldn't place where they were coming from. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the sound seemed to be coming from all around her, as though the very room itself was closing in. Her pulse quickened, and her breath became shallow as the footsteps drew nearer. And then, as quickly as they had started, they stopped. Clara stood frozen in place, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to hold her in its grasp. She turned slowly, half expecting something, or someone, to be standing behind her. There was nothing, but Clara knew that something had changed. The hotel was no longer simply an inanimate structure. It had become something else, something alive, something that could move and breathe and change. It had become an extension of her own mind, an entity that was no longer bound by the walls of the building. The very space she inhabited seemed to shift, as though it were alive, adjusting itself to her presence, to her thoughts. And in that moment, Clara understood something terrible. The hotel was not merely a reflection of her mind. It had become her mind. Every room, every corridor, every shadow was a part of her, a fragment of her thoughts and memories, twisted and distorted by fear and regret. She was trapped, not by the hotel itself, but by the darkest corners of her own psyche. The footsteps returned again, closer now, as though they were marching toward her. Clara didn't dare move. She stood perfectly still, feeling the tension rise, waiting for whatever would come next. The sound grew louder, and then, without warning, a voice, familiar but distant, whispered her name. It was a voice she hadn't heard in years, a voice that belonged to someone she had long since forgotten. The voice called her again, this time with more urgency, with more desperation. And as Clara listened, she realized the truth. The hotel wasn't trying to trap her. It was trying to set her free. The voice wasn't a ghost. It was her own, calling out from the depths of her mind, urging her to face the past, to confront the choices she had made, to stop running from the truth. Clara took a deep breath, her chest tightening as she understood what she had to do. There was no escaping the hotel, no escaping the memories that had bound her here. She had to face them head on, and in doing so, she would find her way out. The only question that remained was whether she could confront the darkness within her, and whether she could survive the consequences of doing so. Clara's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions as she stood at the center of the dimly lit hallway. The silence around her had taken on a palpable quality, heavy and oppressive, almost suffocating. The realization that the hotel had become an extension of her psyche, a tangible manifestation of her fears and regrets, weighed heavily on her shoulders. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, echoing her every doubt and hesitation. Each footstep, each echo in the distance, only reminded her of how deeply entwined her own consciousness had become with the place she had once thought of as a mere hotel. The voice she had heard, familiar yet distant, kept reverberating in her mind. It had been a voice from her past, one she had buried deep within the recesses of her memory. It was the voice of someone she had once loved, someone whose presence had shaped the course of her life in ways she hadn't truly understood until now. That voice had called her name, urging her to remember, to face the truth that she had spent so many years avoiding. But what truth was it? What had she forgotten? And why was the hotel pushing her to uncover it now? Clara began to walk, though her steps felt sluggish, as if the very air was thickening with each movement. She was drawn toward the staircase at the far end of the corridor, the same staircase that had led her into the heart of the hotel on her first day. But now it was different. There was an undeniable sense of foreboding hanging over it, as though the stairs were more than just a physical structure. They were a portal to something else, something hidden, something that could no longer be ignored. As she ascended the stairs, Clara's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. The voice, the footsteps, the strange sense of déjà vu that had plagued her from the very beginning. It was all starting to fit together, but in a way that made her uneasy. The hotel wasn't simply an accident of architecture or a random collection of rooms. It was a deliberate creation, shaped by something far more intricate and insidious than she had ever imagined. And now, as she climbed higher, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led towards something she wasn't prepared for, something she wasn't ready to face. At the top of the stairs, Clara was met with another hallway, this one even darker than the last. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the air was thick with a scent she couldn't quite place, like old leather mixed with a faint trace of something metallic. As she moved forward, her footsteps seemed to echo louder, reverberating in the oppressive silence. She felt a sharp pang of anxiety settle in her chest. This hallway, she realized, was different. It was unfamiliar, even though she had walked through the hotel countless times before. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in, shrinking with each step she took. The hallway stretched out endlessly before her, an unnerving maze of doors and shadows that twisted and bent in ways that defied logic. Clara knew that she had reached the point of no return. Whatever awaited her at the end of this corridor was a truth she could no longer avoid. She could feel it, feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the inexorable pull towards something unknown. And then, as if responding to her thoughts, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't heard anyone approaching, hadn't seen a shadow move. But the door was open, beckoning her inside. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but Clara could make out faint shapes, shadows that flickered and danced as if alive. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. But then she remembered the voice, calling her name, urging her to confront what she had buried within herself. With a deep breath, Clara stepped inside. The room was unlike any she had seen before. It was small, cramped, and sparsely furnished. Just a single bed, a small wooden desk, and an old, rusted mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. But what struck her immediately was the smell, the unmistakable scent of old books, of dust, of time that had been forgotten. As she moved closer to the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection was distorted, twisted, almost unrecognizable. It was as if the very image of her had been warped by some unseen force. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the glass. The reflection seemed to shudder under her touch, and for a brief moment, the room around her blurred. A new image began to take shape in the mirror, a scene from her past, one that she had tried so hard to forget. It was a memory from years ago, a memory of a time when everything had seemed perfect before everything had begun to unravel. She saw herself standing in a garden, laughing, holding hands with someone she had once loved deeply. The memory felt so real, so vivid, it was as though she could step into it at any moment. But then the image began to shift. The laughter faded, and the figure beside her, someone she had trusted, began to change. The man in the mirror was no longer the person she had once known. He was someone else entirely, someone dark, twisted, a shadow of the man she had fallen in love with. Clara gasped, pulling her hand away from the mirror. The image vanished instantly, leaving only her reflection once more. But she knew, deep down, what the hotel was trying to show her. The truth was not about the place or the spirits that haunted it. It was about her, about the choices she had made, the mistakes she had refused to face. The man in the mirror was not just a reflection of her past love. It was a symbol of everything she had tried to deny. It was her guilt, her shame, her unacknowledged sorrow. Clara turned away from the mirror, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her like an anchor. The hotel had been showing her the truth all along, but she had been too blinded by fear to see it. Now, standing in the dimly lit room, she realized that the only way to escape the hotel, to escape its hold on her, was to face the past head-on, to confront the darkness she had been running from and allow herself to let go of the guilt that had haunted her for so long. The hotel was not her enemy. It was her mirror, reflecting the fractured pieces of her soul. And only by piecing them together could she finally break free. Clara stood still as the weight of the truth began to sink into her consciousness. The room felt like it was closing in around her, and yet, in the midst of that suffocating sensation, she found herself strangely calm. It was as if the mirror had peeled away the layers of her mind, exposing something raw and vulnerable beneath. The truth had been revealed, not through any grand revelation from the hotel itself, but through her own reflection, an image of her past that had remained hidden, buried beneath years of guilt and regret. She thought of the man in the mirror, the man who had once been a part of her life, who had once held a place in her heart. His face had shifted, had warped into something unrecognizable, and yet Clara knew with a certainty that went beyond logic, that it wasn't his image that had changed. It was her perception of him, distorted by the bitterness of time and the weight of unhealed wounds. He had not become someone else. He had simply become the person she had been too afraid to face. The man in the mirror was her own creation, just as much a reflection of her inner turmoil as it was a shadow of the past she had tried so desperately to forget. The air around her felt thick, as if the very molecules had become saturated with memories, each one more oppressive than the last. The hotel, with its endless corridors and twisting rooms, had become a manifestation of her fractured mind. Every hallway, every door, every shadow was a reminder of something left unresolved. The place was no longer a mere building. It had become an extension of her own psyche, a physical representation of the fear and shame that had plagued her for years. Clara began to walk again, her steps slow but deliberate. She knew that she couldn't remain in this room forever, that she couldn't let the hotel hold her in this place of revelation. It was time to move forward, to confront whatever awaited her next. But where would she go? The hallways seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, each one as unfamiliar as the last. And yet, she knew there was only one path she could take, the path that led deeper into the hotel, deeper into the labyrinth of her own mind. As she moved through the darkened corridors, Clara felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. Each step was a reminder of the mistakes she had made, the decisions she had regretted, and the relationships she had destroyed. She thought of the man in the mirror again, his face twisted and unfamiliar, and wondered how much of her life had been shaped by the choices she had made in response to that image. Had she truly been in love with him, or had she simply clung to the idea of love, of a life she thought she was supposed to lead? But as these thoughts began to swirl in her mind, another image began to form. It was not the man from her past, but something else, something more insidious, more unsettling. It was the hotel itself, its walls closing in around her, the rooms shifting and distorting, warping into something grotesque and unrecognizable. The hotel had become her prison, and the more she tried to escape it, the tighter its grip on her seemed to grow. It was as though the very architecture of the building had been designed to trap her, to keep her contained within the confines of her own mind. And then, in the midst of her spiraling thoughts, Clara heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. It wasn't just a faint echo in the distance, but a sound that seemed to be coming from just around the corner. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and yet there was something oddly familiar about them. The sound echoed through the hall, growing louder, closer. And then, from the shadows at the end of the corridor, a figure emerged. It was him, the man from the mirror. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure in front of her. He was just as she remembered him, except now there was something different about him. His face was no longer a shadow, but a solid, living presence. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat, as if he had been waiting for her all this time. For a moment, Clara didn't know whether to run or to confront him, but the choice was taken from her as he took a step forward. "You've been running from me for so long," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying an almost predatory edge. "But you can't hide forever." Clara's chest tightened, her mind racing. She wanted to speak, to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. This wasn't the man she remembered, not in the way she had known him. This was something else entirely, something born from her own fears, her own guilt. She could feel it, deep in her bones, the weight of his presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. "You've been running from the truth," he continued, taking another step closer. "You've been running from yourself?" Clara shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm not running," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm just trying to understand." The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a knowing smile, one that spoke of secrets and regrets, of things that had been left unsaid. "You don't need to understand," he said softly. "You just need to face what you've done." With that, he reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, and in that moment, Clara saw everything. The hotel, the corridors, the memories. All of it was a reflection of the choices she had made, the life she had built on the foundation of lies and half-truths. The man in front of her wasn't the source of her pain. He was simply a manifestation of it. He was the mirror she had been too afraid to look into, the face of the past she had refused to confront. Clara's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. The truth, the raw, unfiltered truth, had finally broken through, and it was more than she could bear. The hotel had shown her the cost of that truth, the cost of facing the things she had hidden from herself. And now, in the silence that followed, Clara understood. There was no escaping it, no running away. The truth had come, and it had taken its toll. The only thing left to do now was to face the consequences. Clara's mind was still reeling from the encounter in the hallway, her senses overloaded with the weight of the truth that had been forced upon her. The man, the figure who had materialized from the very recesses of her memories, had become something far more than a simple reflection of her past. He was a living embodiment of her guilt, her regrets, and the unresolved pain she had carried for so long. His words had echoed in her mind, reverberating with the force of a revelation she had not been ready to confront. And now, as she sat in the dimly lit hallway, still trembling from the encounter, the hotel seemed to pulse around her, alive with an energy she couldn't comprehend. It was as though the building itself was shifting, contorting, its walls stretching and compressing in a rhythmic dance that blurred the lines between reality and nightmare. The air felt thick with an unnatural stillness, as though time itself had stalled, suspended in the wake of the truth that had just been unveiled. Clara's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven bursts as she tried to process what had just happened. The hotel, once an imposing structure that seemed detached from her reality, now felt like a part of her, a grotesque extension of her inner turmoil. She pushed herself up from the floor, her legs unsteady beneath her as she fought to regain some semblance of control. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, each one vying for her attention. She needed answers, needed to understand what was happening. The hotel was no longer just a place to stay. It had become a maze of dark memories, a place where the past bled into the present, where the walls seemed to know more about her than she did. Clara's steps echoed through the empty halls as she moved forward, the soft padding of her shoes the only sound in the otherwise silent hotel. She knew she couldn't remain in this place of uncertainty, couldn't let the suffocating grip of the hotel continue to twist her perceptions. She had to find a way to break free from this cycle, to escape the illusions that had been created by her own fractured psyche. But as she moved deeper into the labyrinth of hallways, a sense of foreboding crept over her, the weight of the building pressing in from all sides. With each turn she took, the walls seemed to grow taller, more oppressive. The hallways stretched out endlessly before her, each one more unfamiliar than the last. There was no escape from this place, no clear path leading her out of the maze. It was as though the hotel itself had become a living entity, its very structure shifting and warping to keep her trapped within its grasp. The rooms, once mere spaces, had become landscapes of her fears and regrets. Every door she opened led to another trap, another distortion of reality. Clara's mind was spinning, unable to grasp the full extent of the madness that surrounded her. She had thought she was in control, that she could face the past and move forward. But now, she realized the past was not something she could simply walk away from. It was something that had followed her, something that had taken root deep within her, feeding on her insecurities and fears. And now, it had manifested itself in the very hotel she had come to for solace. The walls, the corridors, the very air, everything was a reflection of her internal chaos, a mirror to the broken pieces of her soul. Suddenly, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature in the hall dropped, and the lights flickered above her, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air seemed to thicken, the oppressive weight of it almost suffocating. Clara froze, her eyes darting around the corridor, searching for any sign of movement. She wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. It wasn't just a sensation. It was a certainty, a deep, unsettling knowing that someone or something was observing her every move. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of her own racing heartbeat. It was as if the hotel had grown sentient, its consciousness intertwining with her own, its gaze fixed upon her every step. Clara turned a corner and found herself in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was old, weathered, its wooden surface scratched and worn by years of neglect. The handle was twisted, as if it had been turned countless times before. A chill ran down her spine as she reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before pushing the door open. What lay behind it? She couldn't be sure, but she knew that whatever it was, it would hold the answer she sought. The door creaked loudly as it opened, and Clara stepped into the room. It was unlike any other she had encountered in the hotel. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was old and decaying, as if it had been abandoned for decades. But it was the mirror on the far wall that caught her attention. It was large, ornate, its surface gleaming despite the disrepair of the room. Clara approached it cautiously, her reflection staring back at her, distorted and unclear. But as she stared into the glass, something changed. Her reflection began to warp, to twist, until it no longer resembled her at all. Instead, the face in the mirror became that of the man from her past, the man who had been waiting for her in the hallway. His eyes were cold, his expression vacant. But then, slowly, his lips began to move, and Clara could hear his voice, soft, haunting, whispering her name. "You've come so far," the reflection said, its voice a low murmur that seemed to echo from deep within the hotel itself. "But you haven't yet faced the truth." Clara recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a doorway, a portal to something far darker than she had ever imagined. The man in the glass was no longer a figment of her past, but a part of the hotel itself, a manifestation of everything she had tried to outrun. She turned away from the mirror, her mind spinning. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let this place consume her any longer. But as she reached for the door, the walls seemed to close in, and the sound of footsteps echoed once again from behind her. The hotel had trapped her once more, and the true horror of her situation began to set in. There was no escape from this nightmare, not unless she was willing to face what lay within her own soul. The truth was waiting for her, and it would not be denied. Clara's mind buzzed with a feverish intensity, the words that had just been whispered to her lingering like a poison on her thoughts. "You haven't yet faced the truth." The voice from the mirror echoed in her mind, its chilling tone seeping into every crevice of her consciousness. She had thought she was seeking answers, a way out of the labyrinth the hotel had become. But now, she realized the answers were not in the hotel, not in the walls or the rooms or the corridors. The answers lay in her, in the darkest parts of her own psyche that she had buried so deeply for so long. Her pulse quickened as she pressed a hand to her temple, trying to stave off the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to engulf her. She had felt the presence of the hotel around her, but now she knew that the true source of its power was not external. The malevolent force that had been pulling at her was not simply a manifestation of her surroundings. It was her own fear, her own unresolved guilt, her own long-suppressed memories. The hotel, it seemed, was not just an inanimate structure. It was a reflection of her inner turmoil, a place where the boundaries between the past and present, reality and illusion, had blurred. Clara's eyes darted around the decaying room, as if expecting to see the man from the mirror materialize once again, his cold eyes fixed on her. But the room remained empty, save for the oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. The mirror, too, was still, its surface reflecting nothing but the faded walls and the broken furniture. Yet Clara knew that the danger was not gone. It was here, within her, waiting to be acknowledged. The weight of this realization settled heavily on her shoulders. She had been running from something deep inside her, that she had never wanted to confront. The hotel was merely a stage for the play of her fears, an elaborate set designed to force her to face the darkness she had spent years avoiding. She could feel the presence of that darkness now, like a shadow that had always been lurking just behind her, growing larger and more impossible to ignore with each passing moment. In a strange way, Clara found herself almost grateful for the revelation. She had been running in circles, consumed by the hotel's twisted influence, but now she saw the truth. It was not the hotel that had trapped her. It was her own mind, her own past, and her refusal to come to terms with the things she had done, the people she had hurt. The reflection in the mirror had not been some external force. It had been the truth she had been unwilling to face. And now, as the walls seemed to close in around her, she knew that there was only one way forward. She had to confront her past. She had to confront the man she had seen in the mirror, not as a figure of fear, but as the embodiment of her own guilt and regret. The hotel had been built from the foundation of her own shattered sense of self, and only by facing the truth of who she was, what she had done, could she break free from its grip. Clara hesitated for a moment longer, her breath catching in her throat. But then, with a steely resolve, she turned toward the door and opened it, stepping into the hallway once more. The air was thick with tension, the very walls humming with a sense of anticipation. The hotel seemed to pulse around her, alive with the energy of her inner conflict. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved forward, each step drawing her closer to the truth she had been avoiding for so long. She could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on her, like an invisible force pushing her toward the inevitable. There was no turning back now. She was committed to the path, committed to facing whatever lay ahead. And then, just as the hallway stretched out before her, a door appeared on the left. It was a familiar door, one she recognized from her past. It was the door to the hotel's forgotten room, the room that had haunted her dreams, the room that had always been locked, always kept hidden. Now, standing before it, Clara knew that this was where the answers lay. This was where she would finally come face to face with the darkness she had been running from. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the room beyond. It was unchanged, just as she remembered it. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture covered in dust. But there was one difference. In the center of the room, sitting in a worn armchair, was the man from her memories. His face was weathered, his eyes vacant, but there was no mistaking it. He was the same man who had appeared in the mirror, the same man who had haunted her thoughts for years. Clara stepped into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to face him now. She had to face the past she had tried so desperately to bury. The man in the chair did not speak, but his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, followed her every movement. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, the silence between them stretching out like an eternity. And then finally he spoke. "You're finally here," he said, his voice low and hoarse, like something dragged up from the depths of a forgotten dream. But it's too late. The damage is already done. Clara's knees trembled, but she stood her ground. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "You think you can change it? You think you can make it right?" "No, Clara. What's done is done. You can't undo the past." Clara felt a wave of despair wash over her, but she refused to let it consume her. She had to understand. She had to know the truth. "I can't undo it," she said, her voice steady. "But I can face it. I can accept it." The man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as if he was studying her for the first time. "You think you can find peace by accepting it? You think you can escape the consequences?" He let out a dry, bitter laugh. "There is no peace for you, Clara. Not here, not anywhere." But Clara, though shaken, felt a flicker of something deep within her, a glimmer of strength she had forgotten she possessed. "Maybe not," she said, "but I can stop running. And that's a start." The man's eyes flickered with something like surprise, but he didn't respond. Clara turned her back to him, walking toward the door. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt different, as though it were no longer the silence of the hotel, but the silence of a decision made, a path chosen. And as she stepped into the hallway, the weight of the past seemed to lift ever so slightly, as though a door had finally been opened, not just in the hotel, but in her own heart. The morning after Clara's confrontation with the man in the forgotten room felt eerily quiet. The hotel, though still its dilapidated self, seemed to hum with a subtle energy, something different, something heavier. Clara could feel the weight of the silence, a silence that was no longer oppressive, but full of expectancy. The air around her felt charged, as if the building itself were aware of her transformation, aware that she was no longer the woman who had entered its confines weeks ago. She had taken a step toward the truth, and the truth was a thing that could not be easily contained. It was as though Clara had peeled back a layer of the universe, exposing a raw, unspoken reality. The hotel, she now understood, was not just a physical structure, but a reflection of the trauma she had carried within her. It had been a mirror, both figurative and literal, forcing her to look at the broken parts of herself that she had ignored for so long. Clara wandered the halls of the hotel, each step filled with a strange sense of finality. She knew that there was one more part of the puzzle she had to uncover, one more truth that needed to be revealed before she could leave. The whispers had quieted. The eerie voices that had tormented her for so long now faded into a distant murmur, barely audible in the back of her mind. But she knew they were not gone. They were waiting for her to finally accept what she had feared the most. She approached the grand staircase, her eyes scanning the now familiar surroundings. The ornate banister, the worn carpet that had once seemed so daunting now felt like an old friend. Each step upward seemed to take her further from the past and closer to the moment of reckoning she had long avoided. It was strange to think how much of her life had been consumed by this hotel, this place of nightmares that had, in the end, become the key to her liberation. Clara reached the top of the staircase and turned down the hallway that she had once feared so much. It was the hallway that led to the heart of the hotel, where the final pieces of her story had unfolded. She could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet, the echo of her own breath in the stillness of the air. The hotel felt alive again, not in the way it had when it was trying to consume her, but in a way that suggested it was acknowledging the journey she had taken, the transformation she had undergone. At the end of the hallway stood a door she had walked past countless times, but had never dared to open. The door was different now. It wasn't just another room, another obstacle. It was the doorway to her past, to the final truth that had eluded her. She approached it slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. For a moment, she hesitated. But then, without thinking, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The room beyond was not what she expected. It was not filled with dust or decay, as most of the rooms had been. Instead, it was bathed in a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The walls were adorned with photographs, photos of people Clara recognized, though not in the way she thought she would. They were not faces from her past, not people she had known, but rather strangers whose lives were intertwined with hers in ways she had never understood. In the center of the room was a mirror, larger than any Clara had seen before. It was framed in ornate gold, its surface gleaming as though it were brand new. She walked toward it, her reflection growing clearer with each step. As she neared, the image in the mirror began to shift, warping and changing, until Clara no longer saw her own face, but the face of a woman she had never met. The woman stared back at her with eyes full of sorrow and longing, and for the first time, Clara felt a deep connection to the stranger in the glass. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. The woman in the mirror smiled faintly, her lips curling in a way that suggested both sadness and understanding. "I am you," the woman said softly, her voice echoing in Clara's mind. "The you have kept hidden?" Clara's breath caught in her throat as the truth began to settle in. This woman, this reflection, was not some other person. She was the version of Clara that had been buried beneath years of denial, the woman who had chosen to ignore the parts of herself that she could not face. This was the woman who had been lost to the hotel, to the memory of the man she had wronged, to the guilt that had haunted her every step. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she realized what had been happening all along. The hotel had not been tormenting her because of some supernatural force or malevolent spirit. It had been forcing her to confront herself, to face the truth that had always been there, waiting for her. The man in the forgotten room, the man in the mirror, they were not her captors. They were her own creation, projections of the guilt and shame that she had carried for far too long. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She wasn't sure who she was apologizing to, herself, the woman in the mirror, the man in the room, or the people she had hurt. But it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt something shift inside her, a deep, healing release that had been waiting to happen. The mirror before her seemed to soften, the reflection of the other woman fading away as Clara's own image returned. She no longer looked like the terrified, broken woman who had first entered the hotel. Her face was calm, her eyes clear, as though the weight of the years of torment had finally been lifted. Clara took a deep breath, feeling lighter, freer than she had in years. She turned away from the mirror, her steps now purposeful. The hotel, for all its strange and haunting presence, no longer held any power over her. She was ready to leave, ready to face whatever lay beyond its walls. As Clara reached the door, she turned one last time to look at the room that had once felt like a prison, but now seemed like a sanctuary, a place where she had been forced to confront herself. The golden light still filled the room, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt warm, comforting, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. And as Clara stepped out into the hallway, she knew that the hotel had no hold on her anymore. The final revelation had come, and with it, the freedom she had been searching for all along. As Clara stepped out of the hotel, the morning air greeted her like a long-lost friend. It was crisp and fresh, carrying with it the scent of dew on grass and the faint tang of salt from the distant sea. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. Clara paused for a moment, breathing in deeply, as though she were inhaling a new life, one that had eluded her for so long. The hotel loomed behind her, no longer the imposing, oppressive structure it had once been. It was a place she had entered with fear and left with something far greater, a profound understanding of herself. She could still feel the weight of the building's history, the echoes of the voices that had whispered to her in the night, but they no longer felt like a threat. Instead, they seemed like the final whispers of a lesson learned, the last remnants of a journey that had shaped her in ways she was only now beginning to comprehend. She took a step forward, her feet no longer dragging as they had in the beginning. The tension that had once gripped her body was gone, replaced by a sense of calm certainty. There was no need to rush now. She had nothing to fear. Everything she had sought, everything she had been running from, had been within her all along. The hotel had simply been the catalyst, the mirror reflecting the truths she had avoided for far too long. Clara walked down the gravel path that led away from the hotel, her footsteps steady and purposeful. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, real, grounding her in the present moment. She passed the row of trees lining the road, their branches swaying gently in the wind, and she couldn't help but notice the way the light filtered through the leaves, casting intricate patterns on the ground. It was a simple beauty, but it was a beauty she had failed to appreciate before. Now, with her mind clearer and her heart lighter, she found herself marveling at the small details of the world around her. As Clara walked, memories of the hotel flooded her mind. She thought of the man in the forgotten room, the haunting presence that had once seemed so sinister. She remembered his face, the pain that radiated from his eyes, and the way he had whispered her name in the darkness. But now, looking back, she understood. He had not been a villain, nor had he been some supernatural force. He had been a manifestation of her own guilt, a reflection of the part of herself that she had long buried. She had feared him because she had feared herself. The realization was liberating. Clara no longer felt the need to punish herself for the mistakes of the past. She had done the work, faced the truths she had long ignored, and now she was free. There was no more need for retribution or self-loathing. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, was behind her. What mattered now was the present, the life that lay ahead, the future she was free to create for herself. As she neared the edge of the property, Clara paused and turned to look back at the hotel one last time. The building stood silent, its windows reflecting the light of the rising sun. It no longer seemed like a place of terror, but rather a monument to her journey, a journey that had taken her through darkness and back into the light. She had entered the hotel as a woman full of fear, burdened by guilt and unresolved trauma. But she was leaving as someone different, someone who had embraced her past, acknowledged her mistakes, and freed herself from the chains that had held her captive. For a moment, Clara wondered if the hotel would continue to haunt others as it had haunted her. Would it always stand as a place for the broken and the lost to confront their demons? She wasn't sure, but what she did know was that the hotel had fulfilled its purpose. It had been the setting for her transformation, a place where she had been forced to look inward and come to terms with the person she had been avoiding for so long. And now, she was ready to step out into the world, no longer afraid of the shadows that had once defined her. Clara's heart swelled with a quiet joy, a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. She had spent so long running, so long hiding from herself, but now she felt as though she had found the path she was meant to walk. There was no need to fear what lay ahead. She had faced her darkest moments and emerged stronger for it. She could face whatever came next with confidence, knowing that she was no longer a prisoner of her own fears. As she reached the road that led away from the hotel, Clara took one last look over her shoulder. The building was just a silhouette now, fading into the distance, becoming a part of the landscape. She smiled to herself, not out of triumph or celebration, but out of a quiet understanding. The hotel had served its purpose. It had given her the gift of self-awareness, of clarity, and of freedom. And with that, she could finally move on. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, Clara felt ready for it. She had shed the weight of her past, and in doing so, she had found herself once again. The journey was not over, but she was no longer the woman who had entered the hotel. She was someone new, someone who had discovered the strength to face her own darkness and emerge into the light. With each step she took away from the hotel, Clara knew that she was walking into a future filled with possibility, a future of her own making.